Well, this is the Encounter Faith Podcast. My name is Ross, and I am so glad you're here because today is a Pastor Tara Beth week. Pastor Tara Beth, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, so excited to be back on the podcast.
So we're continuing on in this series of Exodus, and yesterday was one of those messages where I'm hearing you walk through your sermon, and then I'm feeling this level of conviction in myself, this level of you speaking of, these are things that I've experienced. These are things that I know the people around me have experienced. All while you're talking about, I believe the scripture, and this is why an edit button exists, was Exodus 10 through 11, which most people would not tell you is going to be tied to performance culture.
Yeah.
I want to start off by just asking you to connect those dots. People read Exodus 10, 11, this very familiar sort of Passover story, but you are connecting it to this idea of this sort of performance pressure that we're all feeling today in a way that was unexpected for me as I was hearing you unpack it. Can you help folks who are just listening, even though I want them to pause and go listen to watch the sermon? Can you connect those dots?
Yeah, so I'm a little bit of a Bible nerd, specifically biblical theology.
Sure.
And I love Old Testament theology. And so there was this whole backdrop or foundation of scholarship that I was working off of. To the listener, it might have felt like a hop, skip, and a jump to going into performance.
Sure.
But I was attempting to do something very specific yesterday. And that is, there's a conversation of the differences between merit-based theology in the Old Testament and covenant nomism. Okay. So there's kind of two camps with that. And a lot of this even gets into Pauline theology, and we could majorly geek out. Maybe another podcast, another time.
Yeah.
But
once we get a whole network going, there'll be one just called Tara Bible Nerd stuff.
There you go. But there's a whole conversation on this covenant nomism versus merit-based theology. And that is, those who are in the merit-based theology camp believe that the Israelites were all about works righteousness in the Old Testament.
Okay.
Right? That they were trying to work their way towards righteousness. Perhaps a very simplistic, anemic way to put it is earn their salvation.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's that's not only just a camp, but I would also call it a misconception, and one that I disagree with strongly, passionately. And I think it's really, really important when you get into the Old Testament and when you get into the covenants. Covenant nomism is very different. Covenant nomism is the camp that, no, the Israelites were saved. The law and works were a gift. And we see this in the Psalms. The psalmists talk about the law as good and a gift, and they delight in the law. And this rescue narrative in the book of Exodus is critical, because for the Israelites, that was their salvation.
Sure.
That was their salvation. Was being rescued and redeemed. It's the story of the birth of Israel. And so, when I got into the Exodus narrative, there was so much happening, especially in the Passover, that frankly I wrestled with. This was the most difficult sermon I've written since I've been at Good Shepherd. I spent probably 3 times the amount of time on this sermon because I started over probably about 7 times. And I was frustrated. I took so many different directions and angles with it. And a lot of it was because there's so much behind the Passover text and, the blood on the doorpost. And there's so many different conversations about these firstborn children being what do we do with that taken?
Yeah.
What do we do with that? And, for the longest time I thought, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to spend all of my sermon unpacking this. And,
right.
There's a conversation on the violence of God in the Old Testament. What do we do with that? Is God a violent God? So I decided to stay away from that because I would need 3 hours to unpack that. For anyone interested, there is a fantastic book called Cross Vision by Greg Boyd. There's another series that he's written. It's a 2-part series called Warrior God. and he's been very helpful for me in this conversation. But anyway, all that to say, I chose not to dive into that, and decided to build my sermon based off of the idea of merit-based theology versus covenant nomism, and try to help people see that covenant nomism isn't okay. Like the people of Israel were redeemed, were saved. Okay, so then, I try to say, okay, so how do I drive that home for our folks? Well, performance, merit-based is something that we all deal with. It's something that I deal with. And I started to even reflect. And, God always takes me on a journey in the sermon writing process. And this week in particular, it was like, well, Tara Beth, like you're all about performance.
Right.
And I realized that just so much about the Christian faith is antithetical to performance. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weak and weary, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus was referring to just actually the burden of the law.
Yeah.
And the law, while the people of Israel were already redeemed, there was nothing that they could do to earn their salvation. There was some... to a degree of like a works righteousness, or a posturing might be a better way to put it.
Sure.
A posturing that happened because of the law.
Oh man. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the podcast today. I think that was really great. There's nothing else I want to add.
There's so much, there's just so much like theology oftentimes that's behind a sermon that we just can't get there.
Well, then it's one of the reasons why this podcast exists. I know for a lot of folks who I've been able to talk to, those of you who are listening, you've mentioned this. What you just did is one of your favorite parts, the ability for people to better understand how this is coming together, some of the deeper context that, look, I would love to go to a 3-hour Tara Beth sermon. But that we're going to have to, do that maybe on like a Thursday night or something, people.
You and my husband. And
Lauren
my best
be
friend.
There too.
Yeah, Lauren. We got very few people that would want to listen to me for 3 hours.
But, so there's two different sort of parts of this that I want to pick apart. One of the things that stands out to me as you're talking about this performance pressures that we feel today, you use the phrase, you being a performance addict.
Yeah.
Is the ways in which that has put a stranglehold around our kids.
Yeah.
Where, especially in an area like the area that you and I are living in, our kids, even my kids as young as 8, are feeling a sense of pressure, having to do this right, an inability to make mistakes.
Right. That
is so far beyond what I experienced or what you experienced.
Right.
What I'm curious about is how have you seen this conversation around performance, particularly in the American church, change?
Mm-hmm.
Because we have, I think, sort of fallen into this trap of merit-based.
Yeah.
In the same way that you're talking, but you started this by talking about how you strongly disagree with it. But essentially, how did we get here?
Boy, so some of it is... we could get into a whole history of evangelical theology, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Evangelical theology, it's just a whole nother conversation of the 1950s, the sharing the gospel boom, the evangelism boom that happened, and how we share the gospel. And if, you recall like the bridge illustration with the cross and the idea of, you can't earn it. You can't cross the cavern between us and God alone, that we need the cross. And I think to a degree though, we still, hang on. And then just because like, it's so steeped into the Western culture, like this performance, like everything is performance to the success. We're obsessed with success. And we have allowed success to, like, our understanding of success to leak into the church, and even into our lives and our individual faith. And unfortunately, so often we think that that we have to perform for God. We have to perform for other people. I mean, I was just talking to a new young individual. I won't say whether it's a young man or female, but young individual that's new to our church and felt like this person, they were not worthy to go to an event because of their past. And they felt like they could not possibly darken the doors of this particular event. I have people come forward Sunday after Sunday, unwilling to take communion because they don't feel worthy. They want to come forward for a blessing. And I just want to grab these people and say, but it's nothing you can do to make yourself worthy. Like, right. It is the grace of God that is upon you, that you are a child of God. You are a beloved one of God, that it is not by your works, it is not merit, but it is just grace.
Yeah. There's this expression that I remember picking up during my, I don't want to brag, but religious studies minor while I was getting a theater degree from a pretty good engineering school, about how the Pharisees, they sort of the chief criticism was they built a fence around the law.
That's right.
Cliched expression.
That's right.
And this idea of any sort of structure or, the law itself came from a place of trying to, it was a gift to connect with our brokenness. It was a gift, insert your cliche about it being a diagnosis and that kind of thing.
Yeah. But
we furthered that challenge.
Yeah.
We furthered that brokenness by turning it into a system that we could control.
Yep.
Or turn it into a system that was more measurable.
That's right.
Because you said this thing yesterday where you talked about how God's grace isn't a reward.
Right.
And I think one of the most tragic symptoms or outcomes is probably a better word, of this obsession that we have with success is that even the things we know and we like about God, even the things that we can appreciate, someone who's new to the church or outside the church, we are treating like a destination,
right,
or a finish line,
right,
rather than a fundamental and foundational part of God's character.
Right.
And I guess my question in that is, how do we, beyond hearing the kind of biblical walkthrough that you've given already on this episode, but also that you gave on Sunday, how do we help folks connect this idea that essentially the things you've heard or taken away from previous church experiences are not actually reflective of who Jesus is?
Yeah, and that's it. So the best way to get people there is through practice. And that's why I love that we do communion every single Sunday. The sacrament of gathering around the table for the body and the blood of Jesus is so antithetical to performance and merit. I mean, even when you come forward, the way that we practice it here is someone else places it in your hands. You can't take it.
Sure.
Like, you cannot, put your hand in that bowl.
Yeah.
That's not just a sanitary thing for us. We're very intentional about the practice of intinction, because someone hands it to you and all you can do is receive. And that practice is so formative because every single week we come to the table, we're reminded, oh yeah, that's all I can do is just receive grace. And I think it is something that is just such a centerpiece to worship at Good Shepherd Church. But not even just that it's oh yeah, it's something that we do that's nice, that we like, but because we actually want to chisel away performance-based culture within churches.
Yeah.
Do we have it perfectly right here? No. Do we sometimes like to do cool things on a Sunday that sometimes say otherwise, that, do we like to do a good job? Sure. But we've got to keep it, what's the why?
Yeah.
The why is stewardship.
Mm-hmm.
Stewardship of gifts and resources in this place.
Mm-hmm.
So that way we can communicate the gospel.
Totally.
And so, but we've got to do whatever we can for church to constantly be a resistance against performance.
And that's the thing. because I remember hearing a friend and mentor of mine at I was talking about how he had friends in church production and how they make lasers and smoke machines. And he's like, but they do that to reflect God's beauty. They do that to reflect the majesty, and it's art. Yeah. But we take that so often as, man, that was a cool show.
Right.
And the church is a resistance to performance idea. There's an individual responsibility to that.
Yeah.
That I want to talk about first, because that's what we can carry with us. Part of, I think, in a really almost tragic irony way, is the better you get at communicating this.
Yeah.
Someone, I've said this before to you, someone who communicates as well as you do, it creates this level of expectation where someone can show up and appreciate the show.
Yeah.
Because we put on a good enough show.
Yeah. And that happens every week. I mean, some people, and that's just where they are.
Right. And that was exactly because I want to clarify. I mentioned this last week talking to Pastor Greg on the podcast. My wife, Lauren, and I went through almost an entire year of being at a church and just showing up because we were healing. So if that's where you are.
Yeah. Right.
Like, there's no judgment in what I'm articulating. But what I hear you talking about is actually experiencing the church to its full potential.
Yeah.
If you walk out of the doors of this church or any church where you're listening from and you go, man, that was a great message, and apply zero of it to your life, you are not actually living into the full mission of the church.
Right.
We have this responsibility to resist some of these things and to create this space.
Yeah.
I'm curious the ways in which you've seen that done well, because, you're talking about communion. I can imagine most of the people listening have church experiences where the table was actually the place that they felt the most excluded from.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and I just want to pick up on something you said as well about, someone could leave this place and, never apply anything. And while that isn't, again, that's not performance, but what that is so the Sunday morning is to have transformative disciple-making power. The Sunday morning gathering. It absolutely must. Disciple-making transformative power. It must. Okay? And, for me as a pastor, one of the things I think about is, again, this resistance against performance. Okay, we know that. But also, we've got to be careful that it's not consumption that leads to deformation. Because while the Sunday morning gathering isn't about performance, it's also not about deforming consumption.
Sure. Shoot.
What it is it's about grace that leads to transformation.
Yeah.
Rather than consumption that leads to deformation. Grace that leads to transformation. Okay. So I think that's really important to note, why it's the why. Mm-hmm. Why are we coming together? Why are we worshiping? It's about receiving the grace of God. It's that means of grace that happens at the table that leads to transformation. And so that's why even we don't want people, yes, we want to do a good job to reflect the beauty of God and steward our gifts and resources here. It's not that someone can consume and say, it was a good show. Mm-hmm. It's so that they leave this place having encountered the power of God and the grace of God in their lives, that they leave different. So, what are practices done at churches that feel very exclusionary? That's a great question. Number one, we could just talk about practically the table. People are always so surprised here that we practice an open table.
Right.
Meaning, come one, come all. If you've never been to church before and you are still wrestling through what this is all about, come.
Yeah.
If you have a Catholic background, come. If you committed a heinous crime and nobody knows about, come. Mm-hmm. Because the table isn't just about consumption, but the table isn't consumption, but it's a means to receive grace, which is why we always practice confession before the table. We practice the Lord's Prayer before the table. We are corporately readying our hearts and our souls and our bodies to receive the grace of God. So I think that's one thing. But I think there's also, it goes back to the sermon series 4 that we did a while ago. Mm-hmm. All too often churches put their stakes on the ground of all the things that they are against. And, so that's why we did this 4 sermon series to say, well, we want to be known what we're for. Of course, the risk then is when you start talking about what you're for, people are like, well, does this mean you're against this and you're against this? And so
then you guys hired a comms director to help you figure that kind of stuff out.
That's right. So. Exactly. But we at Good Shepherd, we are never going to be that hard, polarized, bannered church that is anti this and anti that. That's just not who we are.
Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, so much of what I think we go into the corporate responsibility of church's resistance against performance culture, because we have to live that out.
Yeah.
And I question whether or not, I think there's this sort of rose-colored glasses over the way things used to be in a lot of areas. One of them being that there used to be lots of different places where you could disagree.
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that was probably practically true in some cases, but even then it didn't necessarily feel all that true, and certainly not all that true to most people.
Right.
And now the volume of disagreements are so high where even if I'm in a space where I agree with someone, I'm expecting them to agree with me 100%. And I am letting perfect be the enemy of good so often. Mm-hmm. When we are able to get this right, the hope being, in the examples you just laid out, like the person who is here every week, the person who has never come to church before, the person who's committed a heinous crime in secret, all of those folks are in the exact same position of receiving.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen anywhere else on the planet except for the Big C church.
Right.
What I am afraid of is that a lot of churches, and every church, I guess is an easier way of saying this, don't live into that potential. Mm-hmm. We've ceded ground to other institutions, expecting them to do that kind of work for people.
Yeah.
And when you think about leading this church or other churches, like how can churches reclaim some of that territory as a place that people can actually come as they are? Because more and more people are going before they just see the church sign and the entire narrative has been written.
Yeah. 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 I just want to say, we at Good Shepherd, we've not arrived there at all. We are in Brighton Ridge neighborhood, and we have folks here, a lot of white collar C-suite folks here. And I think that can be intimidating for folks that maybe say are blue collar or struggle to make ends meet, or maybe are on food stamps. And I don't know that we totally have embodied such a way to say that we are truly open and welcome to all. I know that, I believe that. But do people believe that when they come here? Do they experience that? Do they feel safe?
And it's one of those ideas where everyone would tell you that that's what they believe.
Yeah.
But how we live it out is what matters. Please, for the love of everything, dear listener, do not take this example literally, but it reminds me of an example of an old Daily Show clip where folks went to the Democratic convention and heard Democrats talking about how they're big tent, big tent, big tent. And then the comedian's question was, okay, well, what about Republicans? They're like, well, not Republicans, right? There's this idea of we can hold these ideals as a nice ideal.
Yeah.
But then with the slightest amount of pushback, the reality comes out.
Right.
I would imagine part of how we're able to change some of this culture or lead a institution like a church is by finding those who are doing that well and magnifying it, finding those who are doing it well and asking them to lead into those spaces, finding those who are embodying this somewhat naturally, almost in their giftings, and prioritizing that seeping into other parts of the church. Is it that formulaic?
Well, no, I mean, for sure, because it's about culture, you know, so we have an idealistic kind of vision of the type of church we want to be, and you establish those cultures, those cultural values by talking about it, by saying this is who we are, this is who we're going to be, and you absolutely are going to put people in positions in places of leadership that embody that.
Yeah.
Because we know that culture leaks, right? And so I want to see, people on the platform praying and talking and even giving announcements, and people around the council table and people on staff and people leading worship that embody those ideals.
Yeah. And I think what a lot of churches need to recognize is how desperate people are for that.
Yeah.
I keep saying a lot of churches. Our church is obviously a part of this. Like, if you look at how lonely people are, if you look at, I talked about this earlier, if you look at kids and the immense amount of pressure that a high schooler today is facing, that just developmentally a 14-year-old was never meant to carry.
Right.
The church, despite all of its faults, despite all of its imperfections, is the one space where that 14-year-old can come as they are.
Right.
Or at least should be able to.
Yeah.
And I think it's a responsibility that we all like to talk about.
Yeah.
But we have to make sure we're living out.
Right.
For everyone. I remember talking to our students minister, Elizabeth, on this podcast, and she was talked about how she wants introverts as leaders because, who has a really hard time in high school? Introverts.
Yeah.
And having someone who had that experience, in high school, who's now an adult, they're going to see them more than the sort of stereotypical youth pastor extrovert type. Last question, just to kind of put a finer point on it. This is one of those things where we've gotten into this. We're all guilty of trying to perform for God, trying to earn his love.
Yep.
But then I think about how when we accept that grace isn't a reward, when we accept that this is a gift and we sort of get into proper alignment, I'm curious, in the times in your life where you feel like that has been true for you, what does that feel like? Because I imagine there's a lot of folks listening right now who are feeling like they're performing for God. They're feeling the burden of that. And I want to end on a note that sort of reminds people where they could be going.
Yeah. So when Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weak and weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." Jesus was absolutely getting at the Pharisees and the Sadducees who had burdened down the law that was once a gift. And they were so burdened that the yoke that they were carrying was so heavy. And Jesus was saying, you don't have to carry that. And when we can discover the easy yoke and the light burden of walking in the way of Jesus and discovering that we don't have to carry the weight of performing, that we don't have to carry the weight of merit based theology, but instead we can walk in the daily rhythms of grace. It's freedom and it's joy, and that is what I have experienced. For me, it's joy would be probably the essence of his joy comes in the morning. His mercies are new every day, that I don't have to wake up with a worldly type of fear, afraid of whether or not I'm going to perform okay. But instead, I can walk in the grace of God, that the grace of God is going to get me through my day. And I just have to say, for me as a pastor, this is huge. For very long, my identity was so rooted in whether or not I was going to be a successful pastor or not. It has only been within the last few years that God has completely unlodged that from me. I mean, unlodged it. So let's talk about Tara Beth. That was really concern about performance as a pastor and even as a Christian. Like, and for me, even like I didn't know how to separate Pastor Tara Beth versus Christian Tara Beth, Pastor Tara Beth versus Child of God. It was so tightly wound together that it took me a long time to unwind that. So whenever I would get, say, an angry email from a congregant 5 years ago, well, my day was ruined. Because that meant that I didn't perform well.
Sure.
These days, I get it. Take a deep breath. Maybe smile. I pray about it. I write a response. And I move along. And it has taken years for God to unlodge that from me. And there's been some practices in my life. I mean, it began, one of the reasons why my therapist told me to start riding horses is because it was literally the only thing I could do that wasn't about performance. Before that, I loved hiking mountains.
Sure.
But I was also like obsessed, like how many calories am I going to burn up this mountain? What's the exercise I'm going to get? Horses became the only place where it wasn't about performance. And that was the beginning of my life being changed.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran, and our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.